everyone.
Welcome, everybody. Excited to have everyone here today. We're going to go ahead and give it a minute or so for people to join the session. And while everybody is joining the room, I'm going to welcome myself and my wonderful speakers today. For those of you who are joining me for the first time, my name is Megan Strout, and I'm the founder and CEO of Tack Advisors, which helps organizations with hiring, onboarding, and training chiefs of staff and executive assistants to help them save their most valuable resource, which is their time, which is a really important topic that we're going to talk about today, which is bringing people together and making sure that you're driving ROI when people are coming together. So before we jump into the actual content, I want to give a couple of quick housekeeping items for those of you who are joining us. We cannot see or hear you, so hopefully you can see and hear us. We do have our chat enabled right now, so if for some reason you can't see or hear us, please let us know. And while you're coming into the room, I'd love to see where everybody's joining us from. So if you want to drop in the chat right now where you're joining, I know we have a pretty wide network of people all over the world. It's always fun to see where you're joining us from. Okay, great. Well, I want to talk a little bit before I have Lindsey and Beth introduce themselves and go into the topic of this, of how I got connected with both Lindsey and Beth. And it really starts with Beth. I think, Beth, we've known each other, I feel like since the early days of Tack. And I feel like
Yep.
every time we've connected, it's always been about your like hunger and desire to learn and develop and bring value to the different companies that you have been at, which has been so much fun because it's something I'm clearly very passionate about. And so a couple months ago, when Lindsey sent me a DM on LinkedIn saying that Beth had referred her, I was like, oh, I have to speak to this woman because I think so highly of Beth and what she's done, working especially at Fivetran, most recently as the lead executive assistant there. And so Lindsey and I had this wonderful meeting and conversation. I felt like we were so aligned. On just the way that we think about bringing people together, the way that we do professional development, and how we drive ROI for businesses. And so they're going to talk a little bit today about the strategy behind bringing people together. In this particular case, we're going to focus on an offsite that Lindsey helped Beth plan. But I want to be really clear that this particular session is about any type of bringing people together. It can be offsites, it can be weekly team meetings or monthly meetings, it can be all hands, it can be anything where people are coming together and you're hoping to get some kind of good return on your investment. And so I think it's such an important topic. I'm so excited. We've done sessions in the past on planning events that we're all focused on logistics. That is not what this session is about today. This is coming from a very new, fresh perspective on the strategy behind bringing together. So hopefully I gave a good synopsis. I don't know. How do you think, Beth and Lindsey? Did I set you guys up for
That was
success
great.
today? Okay, great. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to both of you. And maybe, Lindsey, you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. Thanks for having us, and hello to everyone out there. Yes, my name is Lindsey Caplan, and I'm the founder of a consultancy called The Gathering Effect, and I help business leaders more effectively influence one-to-many. So, I often work with EAs and chiefs of staff, helping execute your principal or executive's vision for change, and offsites are one of the ways that we do that. And so I'm super happy to be here with all of you today. And one of the companies I had the privilege of working with is Beth and Fivetran. And so I'd love for Beth to introduce herself as well.
Sure. Thanks, Lindsey. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth. I've been an EA for about 10 years. I currently work at a company called Fivetran, supporting our chief legal officer. Prior to working at Fivetran, I worked as an independent contractor supporting multiple executive clients. And it feels like what was a previous life. I also worked with existing and aspiring executive assistants to teach them how to launch their own business and provide next level support to C-level executives.
Awesome. So let's set the stage as to what you're going to walk away with. We've shared the who, now here's the what. So two objectives for our time together. One, hopefully some really practical and actionable tips, and then two, answers to your burning questions. We'd love to hear your questions. And so let's share how we're going to accomplish this. What you can expect is Beth and I will share the story of our work together and sprinkle in those tips for about 30 minutes or so. Then we're going to have some dedicated time for your questions. And Megan was graciously monitoring the chat and the Q&A. And so feel free to use the chat to connect with us, your fellow attendees, but put specific questions in the Q&A area. You will get the recording. So please don't worry about that. So we've shared the who, the what, the how. Now let's go into a little bit about the story and some of the why. And yeah, so Beth, do you want to share a little bit more about kind of the story of why you wanted to work together and what you were looking to solve?
Yeah, thank you. So a couple years ago, I was tasked with organizing an offsite for our legal team, as I'm sure many of you are probably responsible for doing for your own teams. This was right after the pandemic, and we were facing some challenges. We had rifts or layoffs happening, low engagement, a packed business agenda. And this was kind of a rare opportunity to bring everyone together in person for the first time after COVID. But our main goal was to boost engagement. And as an EA, I could handle the tactical and the logistical side of event planning. But I really wanted more, and my executive and I wanted more. We wanted the team to walk away feeling more connected to each other and the company. So I didn't just want the offsite to be good. I wanted it to be great, but I knew that I needed help from someone who specializes in this and in the strategy of how to get the most out of in-person time. So that's where Lindsey came in. I had heard a podcast of Lindsey talking about offsites, and she sounded like an expert, and I felt like I needed expert help. So I reached out to her and hired her to help us take this offsite from good to great.
I'm so glad you listened to that podcast. I want to find out which podcast that was, but thank you.
Beth, you
And
have to tell us so we can share it
Yeah,
afterwards
I'll
in
have to
our
link it. Yeah.
post-webinar email.
um, and to Beth's point, I mean, I think these are common challenges that I've heard. How do I connect not just to the employees, but connect more to the company, especially when things are difficult? And how do I retain and improve employee morale and engagement? Offsites are a great way to do that, but oftentimes we don't know how, or we misuse this tool. And so I say that because if you're facing these similar challenges, you're not alone. This is super common. And so happy to walk through what we did here with Beth. And Megan, I'm just curious, is this something that you've experienced too in your work?
All the time. And I was actually just thinking about this kind of in preparation, like the past few searches, on the recruiting side of our business, the majority of the work we do is supporting executives with hiring very senior executive assistants, executive business partners, and then chiefs of staff. And the more recent case studies that we have had our clients do, one was around offsite planning, and then another one was around like the strategy behind like community management for one of the companies, and both of them didn't want them to plan the logistics. The whole case study was, what was your thought process and what's the strategy behind like how you would approach this? Don't plan the offsite, don't plan the community engagement. Walk us through the questions that you would ask to get to the goal, and then how you would go about like communicating that to your executive. And so I just think like that's really, I think, what shifts you from, Beth was saying, good to great, or from like tactical to proactive and strategic in your role, whether you're an EA, a chief of staff, or some other type of support position.
I love that. I want to see that case study. That
I
sounds
can
so
share them
fun.
with you. Yeah.
I'm like, let me see. Thanks for sharing. So let's just set the stage a little bit more before we dive into these tips, right? So I don't think I have to tell you folks watching on the webinar that offsites are important. They're pretty high stakes. I actually believe that they're high stakes for many reasons. One of them is because, especially in a post-pandemic or remote or hybrid world, offsites are our culture on display. And there's actually always something at stake when we want to bring people together or influence them in some way. And so part of what I'm suggesting that you do is understand what's at stake for you, your principal, your executive. Why does this matter to them? That will really support you in understanding the strategy and making sure you help them succeed. And so, Beth, I'm curious if you can share kind of what was at stake for you. Shared a little bit more. You shared a bit already, but share a little bit more about what was at stake for you in your executive in this offsite.
Sure. What was at stake for us? Number one was people's time. As somebody who's like responsible for the management of an executive's time and other people's time, I take it very seriously. So that was number one, people's time. Next was our team's engagement, which I talked a little bit about. Also on the line is my executive's reputation and the motivation, the morale, and the productivity of the team that would be the result of this offsite.
Yeah, I think all of that is super important. And I'd love for folks in the chat to share a bit more about, what's at stake for you, both in why you decided to come here and what you hope to learn, or why you're finding offsites are high stakes or important for you in your organization. Other things I've heard, over time is just that there's fewer chances to come together. And so we need to make them more meaningful. It's hard to take people away from their families for a day, a week, ask them to fly across the country. And they're expensive. These offsites are
So
big.
expensive.
Yes. I actually have a calculator on my website where if you're curious, you can actually type in some numbers like number of attendees and time, and you can find out for yourself how expensive they are. So just be careful. It might be a little bit of sticker shock for you. So let's just set scope for this conversation. Just one more slide. I promise I'm not trying to tease you before we get to the tips too much, but I think I tend to see folks come to me with two different types of desires, or I'm hearing this a lot more post-pandemic. We want to use our offsites for one of two things. One, the kitchen sink. Can we have this be a panacea to solve for everything that's going on wrong in our organization? So maybe your principal or your executive is like, I want to solve for 12 things: trust and alignment and connection. And that's what I call the kitchen sink. The other scenario is casual. I want to take folks to Mexico for a week and have them play pickleball and have some fun. That's cool. However, for today, we're talking about the kitchen sink. And I think this is really, really common. And in that way, today, we're speaking to you with the lens of your role as less of the tactics, right? And more of the gatekeeper, the strategist, quality control, the person who's helping to lead this and be an effective steward of this change, this influencing opportunity, and of course, of people's time and energy. So if we haven't set the stage and the stakes already, I hope it's clear why this matters. Let's get into the meat of this. Let's see. One of the first things that we did, Beth, as I recall, was clarify your desired effect. So what do you want to achieve? It's purposeful that my company is called the Gathering Effect because the effect is so important. Beth, do you want to walk us through a little bit of where we started and what we did?
Sure. Yeah, I think where we started is kind of in line with what you described as there was a lot we wanted to accomplish. We had input from a few different stakeholders. So the agenda initially had been kind of jam-packed from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., a lot of boilerplate content around mission, vision, strategy, OKRs, the following year's goals. But once we engaged with Lindsey, she suggested that we first start by validating our desired effect by interviewing the stakeholders. So number one, that was my executive sitting down with her. And then after that, all of the managers of our sub teams, and then the rest of the team. I think the most important thing here was Lindsey wanted us to make sure that what we were doing was being created with people instead of at them. So we weren't making any assumptions about what it was our team needed during this time. We were getting that information from them. And so we didn't just get alignment on the problems that we wanted to solve, but we also helped to get everybody's buy-in in that process.
I love that. And if you are sitting here thinking, that sounds like that takes a lot of time. Beth, did it actually take you a lot of time to do this
No,
process?
I mean, plugging a few questions into a Google sheet, but if more than anything, even if it did take a lot, it was so worth it, just that little bit of time to see what we got back from the team.
Yeah, I think this idea of ownership involvement leads to commitment and ownership. And that's what you want. I'm a big believer that these offsites can be designed in a way that doesn't just achieve compliance, where people do what they have to do because they're told to, but because they want to. And designing it in this way strategically can help you achieve that. So when people show up to the offsite, they already feel included and involved. And so this is why we do things like this. More specifically, I want to arm you with some questions you can use to go back to your principal or executive, or if you're creating the offsite yourself, to clarify, you can list all of them, to clarify your desired effect. And as you look through these questions, partially what you might notice is we're not asking about topics. We're not asking, do you have a cool guest speaker that you want to bring in to talk about something? I mean, that might be a part of your offsite, but what you want to understand is pain points. What you want to understand is what's the desired effect, what's the problem that we're solving for. If you ask for topics, you'll get topics, and that's why you'll get the kitchen sink. If you ask for pain points, I think you'll get more clarity. You'll get stories, and you'll have a clearer idea of how to measure success. And so one of my most important tips, probably the most important, is to start with your desired effect before anything else. So Beth, do you want to share sort of where we landed with Fivetran's desired effect?
Yeah, sure. So this is what our desired effect was, essentially created our objectives, and this is where we landed. Number one was understanding our team strategies and goals. Super simple, not loaded with a bunch of fluff and words. This is just number one, what we wanted to do. Number two was learning how our individual contributions on the team supported the company as a whole and our maturation. Lastly, we wanted to leave aiming one team, one dream. That was our company's most, I guess, talked about value. And so we wanted to be have that embodied within the team. And then as Lindsey was mentioning, we're doing this with people, not at them. So even after we nailed down these objectives, we were involving the team every step of the way. We ran this by the managers to make sure it sounded good, and then we communicated it after it was finalized. And this was the first thing and the last thing that we talked about at the offsite itself, was these three things.
Love that. I think it's so great, the fact that you continued to engage them throughout the process, so they were really invested and excited to go.
Yeah. That clarity is kind. I think oftentimes, how many times have we walked into any off or any gathering, a town hall even, where we're not sure what we're gonna receive, right? And then I think that uncertainty can be kind of dangerous for the brain. We want to be told where we're headed. We want to know why. That's one of the reasons why we walked you through at the beginning of this webinar, the who, what, why, and how. That clarity, I think, helps relax us so we know what we're going to expect. And my request to you, my advice to you, is to do the same thing with your employees at your offsites and gatherings. So let's go to the next tip. As I mentioned, there's three. So this is the second one. And this might be the most controversial one. I love a little controversy from time to time. So we can put all these on the screen, Beth. I believe an agenda is really one of the last things that you should be creating, not the first. Oftentimes when clients come to me, they'll say, here's my agenda, can you give me some feedback? And it lists a bunch of sessions and it lists a bunch of topics. And one of the first things I do is I say, we need to give this some structure. We need to give this a nice wrapper so people know where you're taking them, versus just kind of this session, this session, this session. Once you clarify your desired effect, it's much easier to know what to include in your agenda and what not to. It makes agenda crafting more purposeful and less personal. And I'm throwing a lot out here, but I'm trying to kind of make the point that if you are receiving last minute requests from every department to come and speak at your offsite, or can we include this session or this session, or what about this? Having clear desired effects makes it much easier to be that gatekeeper, right? And so this is why it's so important. We talked about the importance of structure, and Beth will share in a second how we did this at Fivetran. Some other tips to consider. It might be useful to group your agenda by questions you're going to answer versus just topics. So what's on tap for Q3? You probably find a more engaging question than that. But what that does is it helps people become more curious for the answer and pulls people into the experience versus just pushing information at them. And once you have that, again, that desired effect, your goal, my goal, if I work with you, is to create maybe one experience, discussion, activity, etc., per desired effect. And then people know exactly why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah, so I'll pause there. Beth, tell us a little bit more sort of how we incorporated this with Fivetran.
Yeah, for our structure, I think we focused on those three objectives, but there was a subject in each of those objectives. So for example, Our structure that we used that year was I, as an individual, we, our sub teams within legal, our employment team, privacy and compliance, things like that. And then all, which was our entire legal team. So we structured our agenda with sessions that followed that and those subjects. Another example of a structure we used this past year was the what, why, and how. So we built our agenda and our sessions around what are we doing? Then the next ones were why. And then lastly, how were we going to do those? To give a quick example of one of the activities that we did, it was called the celebrity interview. Lindsey introduced us to this. So it was an hour long, and this is basically where you enable a larger group of people to connect with a leader or expert, in our case, a celebrity, which was our chief legal officer.
Wait, Beth,
So this,
you're saying Taylor
yeah.
Swift didn't come to the webinar? It wasn't like,
I know
I'll come
offsites
to
are
that one.
I know offsites are expensive, but we didn't quite have the budget for that. But essentially, this celebrity interview allowed people to grasp the nuances in the personal narrative and what would otherwise be like a passive or boring presentation. So yeah, part of the value Lindsey provided to us was recommending sessions like this centered around our desired effect and structure. And this really allowed people got them involved rather just sitting and listening in. And I'll also link the link to this specific celebrity interview with the how to do it and what it is. I'll link that in the chat, and we'll send it after the webinar as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to say what I want to say about this. I think it's common for folks to say, do you have a cool activity, or do you have a cool icebreaker, or do you have a cool guest speaker for the offsite? And my initial response is always like, okay, what's your desired effect? What do you want to achieve? And it's hard to maybe get clarity on that. And so again, my encouragement is we don't piecemeal and sort of like put the puzzle pieces in. We want to understand what the end state of the puzzle is. And then it's much clearer how the pieces all fit together versus asking for little bits and pieces. I do want to say I understand why this happens, though. I understand we're under a lot of pressure and we don't always have the authority to sort of make these kinds of decisions. Our hope is that we're arming you with ways to be more strategic and to, help your principal or executive achieve their goals in much more impactful ways. And that's really my hope. We're talking about agendas for a couple more slides because I think they are often our safety blanket. Like if I can just get an agenda together, then I'll feel good. And I totally get that. And so this is why crafting good agendas are so important. I want to offer a couple of ideas here. My encouragement to you is to create effect agendas, not just content agendas. This is an example from a town hall where maybe it's like, oh, I'll get this department update, and then we'll have finance and engineering, and then HR, and then product. And if I've been in those situations, I tune out when it's not relevant to me. I'm like, well, I'm not in engineering. Why do I have to pay attention? If you craft your agendas with the effect, the so what of that section, it'll be much more impactful. And so, if you are the one crafting the agenda, I hope you can use this to help bring people along and make it more effective in the process.
I love that. I think it's great.
Wonderful. So let's see. A couple other tips. If you're like, why is a slide from Severance in this webinar? This is a really cool show. If you're not watching the show, I highly suggest you watch it. But also, I think it teaches us a really important lesson. My background of a long, long time ago was I was a screenwriter in Hollywood. And you're like, how does this relate? I'll tell you another time. But one of the devices that television shows and movies do is something called a central question. They ask a central question of the audience that keeps them engaged and curious and wanting to tune in to know the answer. Any of you watching Love is Blind this season, we tune in because we want to know, yes, is love blind? Do they stay together? Okay. Those of you that watch White Lotus, we want to know who gets murdered or who the murderer is. For Severance, we want to know what the hell is happening at Lumen Industries, right? I'm not asking you to have such a severe central question for your offsite, but what question are you answering for the people that you've gathered? And how does that connect people more effectively to the content, get people involved in wanting to know what the answer is, and give you that sense of structure? Last tip on agendas here is this idea of we want you to think of your agenda like a recipe, not a list of ingredients. So where are those ingredients leading us? Are we making a cake? Are we making a souffle? Are we making a waffle? Whatever we're making, we want to focus on that end state, not just the ingredients. So I think I'm hammering this point home. You can use whatever metaphor or analogy supports you, but I want to offer several ways for you to think about this so that you can influence your principal or executive. Megan, we'll pause for a second. Any thoughts on what we've shared here, or any I don't know.
No, I mean, I think I love it. And again, I kind of want to hit home that while today we're kind of using this case study of this offsite that Beth, brought in Lindsey for. I mean, I think this is even relevant for just any type of meeting you're having. And I think that, the most impact that anybody in these support roles has is saving time and saving money. And, often when an EA or chief of staff initially come into an organization, the first thing they do is they take a look at the calendar, they take a look at recurring meetings, they take a look at, what's the operational cadence, and really, really great EAs and chiefs of staff go, this doesn't make sense. Like, why are we bringing these people together? Like, there isn't an agenda for this meeting. We're wasting time. And I just think that what we're sharing today and this thought of what's the end result? What is the content we're going over? Is this make sense? Is there driving an ROI? Whether it's a meeting, an offsite, a town hall, or whatever, this is such a great way to reframe the way you're thinking about it and make suggestions to really optimize the ROI for every time you are together as a team.
Yeah. A few things I want to say before we go to the final tip. Let's see if I can remember them all. One, please put your questions in the Q&A if you have them or you're thinking of them, because we'll get to that in about 5 minutes. Two, if you are listening to this and you're like, oh, this explains why that offsite wasn't effective, or this explains why as an employee I was frustrated with this gathering. Yeah, my hope is to sort of give us this common language as to how to do this more effectively. Oftentimes we haven't experienced great, and so we're fine with the status quo. I'm not cool with the status quo. I don't know about you. I want to keep pushing us forward. And so my goal is to help you do that as well. And I forgot the third tip, but maybe I'll get to it at some point. So let's get to tip number 3. And so this is about bring your offsite home. Remember to land the plane. What do I mean by this? Oftentimes what I see with offsites is we're very hurried at the end. We have to wrap up very quickly, and then we miss a really important moment to let the content sink in and stick. We lose a lot of effectiveness. And so just like an airplane, there are certain rituals and rhythms that we go through so that the plane can land safely. We put our seatbelts on, we put our tray tables up, all those kinds of things. I'm asking you to do the same thing for our offsites. And what does that look like? Basically, it means I want you to dedicate time, or ask your principal or executive to dedicate time to reflect on what the heck we just did. What did it mean? What did we accomplish? And then work on how do we apply it. Oftentimes the gap in effectiveness for these offsites is we focus too much on it, the content, and not enough on us. So how we as a group or a company will work together based on what we heard or what we did. And this means we get a steep drop off in the quality and effectiveness of the gathering, right? If we don't do this. So I want you to spend time on integrating the material and not just sharing it. So, I think last thing I'll say here, I think that's really our job when we gather people, is to make sure that we can close the gap between the information that we share and someone's ability to do something with it. And if we land the plane, I think we can really help people do that. So if we can share the next slide, I'll share with you what this looks like. What I'm asking you to do is to leave time in the agenda at the end of a day, at the end of an offsite, or at the end of a very content-heavy section, and give dedicated time to reflect on people's ahas and takeaways. Specifically, how will we take this information forward? What might get in the way? And what are we going to do with this? I see a shocking number of offsites and gatherings that miss this step. So you can do this alone, you can do this in pairs, you can do this as an entire organization. Many ways to do this that are more introvert friendly, but this is my encouragement to you, is to really, really make this a key part of your gathering. So Beth, I'm curious to know, how did you integrate this for Fivetran?
Yeah, so on the topic of reflection, what we did this year on day one of the offsite, the very first thing I did as people were filtering in, getting their coffee, sitting down, is I had a prompt on the screen and on the wall that said, "What do you hope to accomplish or get out of this week's offsite?" And then I gave them post-its, and so everybody wrote what they hoped to get out of the offsite that week. And right next to that, I had a section for done. And then on the last day, I invited everybody to physically get up, go grab the post-it that they created on day one and move it to the done section if they felt like that thing had been accomplished that week. And then at the end, asked volunteers to share what they wrote down and how they accomplished it. And it's funny, I think a lot of people were just looking to connect with other people in person. That was like a lot of people's desire that week. And it was fun to get to learn the personal experiences they had with each other and how they did that.
Mm. What I love it. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just love what, because you're physically going and getting up and moving something. And so I think that was that what you were gonna say, Lindsay, of like people
No,
love
but I
to
love that
check a
too.
box.
Yeah.
People love to like see something complete. And I'm sure like afterwards you had a bunch of stuff in the done piece, and that visual like made it visual for people to be like, wow, we actually accomplished a lot during this.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
I love it for that reason. And I was going to share another reason too, which is I spent about 12 years in an internal learning and development role. So a large part of my background is adult education. And our job is not just to increase someone's competence, like do they know the material, but their confidence in using it. And so something that Beth just described, it really visually shows people the confidence in a way that everyone can understand and sort of see and increase that sense of like, oh, we can do this and we did do this, which is a really important way to get people's involvement and emotional commitment to the organization. So I love this for many reasons, and go Beth.
I
So
actually have a question. I don't know if we want to quick ask it because it is relevant to this. I know we were going to wait for Q&A at the end, but one of the attendees said, how would you suggest, because that was a great like end of the
mhm.
like end of your offsite, having people move that over, but then post your session, how would you recommend continuing to check in on progress and making sure that people are hitting these goals that you've set?
Yeah, I think this is the $1 million question. What do we do next? What's the follow-up? I think it's more important there's follow through versus follow up. One of the ways I suggest people do this is something called after shows, which is another concept I borrowed from entertainment. So if anyone watches like Bravo and Watch What Happens Live or those other silly shows, they have after shows where they discuss the show in more detail. And my suggestion to you is to schedule these after shows with small groups, maybe specific sub teams within legal or um, people who are close to the work that you do or you all work together more specifically, schedule those after shows so they are able to keep talking about and personalizing and implementing the material. Make it just a part of the practice of the organization. And if you call it an after show or something like that, I think it can be a little bit less jargony or a little bit less forced. Um, and that's part of the reason why you spend that time on what will we do going forward, and what could get in the way. Because oftentimes it's not about um, desire. We want to continue this, but there's something else getting in the way. And it's really important to name what that might be, what the villain is of the change that we want to produce. So I hope that helps answer partially what I would suggest.
Great.
Actually, let me say one more quick thing about that. I think part of the reason why we're suggesting ways to do these offsites with people, not at them, is so they want to continue this. They want to carry it forward. They want to put the post-it note on the wall. And if we design it in a way where it's very compliance driven, it's going to be much harder to get that follow through and follow up. It's going to feel like pulling teeth. So this is why the strategy is so important. Great question. And if I didn't answer it for you, feel free to reach out and we can chat more. What I'd love to do though, Megan, if it's okay, is land the plane for ourselves.
Land the
And
plane.
practice what we preach. What we want to show you is sort of what happened with Fivetran. And Beth, if you want to share the next slide. So, spoiler alert, it went well. Yay.
Yay.
Beth, do you want to share some of what these numbers mean and why?
Sure. Yeah, so you'll notice these questions are just direct questions of what our three objectives were. But the very first thing we asked was, were the objectives and the goals of the on-site clear and well communicated? Number one, that's the thing that we've been talking about, creating it with them and making sure it was communicated. So 60% of the people who attended the offsite completed this survey, and across the board, unanimously, 100% positive results on that they felt like they knew what they were there to do and that we accomplished the things that we were there to do. Yeah.
Go us. Go Beth.
Go Beth.
Thank you, Lindsey. It was a from good to great moment for sure.
Yeah, and just to kind of circle back here, I mean, I think we talked about what was at stake for you and your executive early on. I mean, where did we end up with that? How do you feel about kind of yeah, go ahead.
I think that what we talked about initially, what I was saying was most important to me was people's time. Like it was something that they left their families for a week and all the things that they normally do, and they spent time, but they didn't feel like it was a waste of time. So number one, I feel like that's huge. It's the biggest compliment I could get when somebody doesn't walk away being like, "Oh my gosh, what a waste of time." I like couldn't be more embarrassed if somebody had had that experience. So I'm glad that number one, it was a good use of people's time, but also our team's engagement. At the end of the day, this brought people closer together. And so with their higher engagement, that leads to higher motivation, morale, productivity, which has an effect on our organization and also my executive's reputation. That she entrusted me to put this on and help plan it with you and the help of our director of legal operations. So I would say with the combination of all of us, it was a success for her and for everyone.
I am so glad to hear that. That's the goal, right? So let's, if we can, just again keep landing the plane for ourselves and remember these 3 tips that we shared before we open it up to questions. So we want you to clarify your desired effect. It's number 1. Please, please, please do that. Think about a structure, not just an agenda. So Beth shared this idea of I, we, all, or what, why, how, a central question. There's many ways to create a structure, which helps sort of reduce uncertainty and let people know where you're taking them and why. And then lastly, land the plane. Please, please, please bring the offsite home so that you increase your chances of this sticking and being more more effective. And what was I going to say? Yeah, I think if we don't do this, chances are you might hear from your principal or your executive, let's just do another offsite. Let's keep rinse and repeating this until we get this right. And it's not so much about the quantity of offsites, it's about the quality. So you'll save time, money, hopefully headache by thinking more strategically in this way from the get-go. And so I'm just curious, you know, I'm curious to know in the chat what one of your takeaways was, what's landing with you. And then Beth, I'd love to hear for you kind of what was your biggest takeaway in this process of working together?
Yeah, I think, working with you, Lindsey, I think the biggest thing I took away was honing in on the desired effect. I mean, that's your North Star. And everything that we did and everything that, should be done when you're planning one of these is structured around your North Star, especially if you have multiple stakeholders. Like you mentioned, you'll have everybody chiming in. Can we do this? Can we do that? But if you have that one thing that you've all agreed upon, it's really easy to stay focused and to stay aligned with that and what you're hoping to achieve. So
I'm glad to hear that. I would say my one takeaway I hope you all leave with is yes, these 3 things, but to think about this idea that we don't change because of content or what information is shared in an offsite. We change when we are affected by that content, by, the material that's shared. And so our job is to help people feel the effect of it. And you can do this through compliance, but I think it's much more effective to do this in a way that produces engagement. That is the long-term effect that I think many of us are after, but it's likely that we're designing them unintentionally in ways that are actually getting us compliance. And so just think about the idea that we want to help people be affected by the content, not just share it. That's really, I think, what we're after. So, Megan, any reflections from you before we open up to Q&A?
I'm just so glad that we did this, and I'm so grateful for both of you, because I'm looking at all of the chat, and so many people already are sharing how much that they feel like this has been so impactful for them. So I'm excited to jump into Q&A because we have some that came in through both chat and the Q&A function. So let's get to it.
Let me actually ask one quick thing before we do this. So for those of you that are going to jump off, Beth, do you mind just going to slide 21 real quick?
Sure.
So if you have to jump off or just want this information now, feel free to scan these QR codes. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn or my website. I love nerding out about how to influence one-to-many and offsites and gatherings of all shapes and sizes. So feel free to reach out, and just want to let folks have that information now. But yes, let's go to the Q&A.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna in no particular order, everybody. Okay, so the first question was, any suggestions when dealing with individuals who come from another culture where arguing is encouraged and often allowed to go on too long so that other participants become uncomfortable?
Wow. I'll take this one, Beth. Don't worry. I think it's really hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. I think in this case, it's really helpful to hire a facilitator or someone who's skilled in handling these kinds of dynamics. One thing we didn't talk about with Beth is I did the strategy and the design, not the facilitation. And you don't have to have someone do all three, but I think in this case, you want to have someone who's really adept at these kinds of issues. I can't speak to the cultural piece so much, but I can speak to understanding what it's like to be in a room with people who want to argue. I would say this: I think most of the time people just want to feel heard and they want to feel seen. And sometimes these people just have to get this out. I would maybe take this person aside and have that conversation with them. However, sorry, there's so much to say about this. In some ways, I think this is a good sign, though. It shows that this person is engaged and they have opinions. You just want to channel it productively. The worst thing that can happen is when they become apathetic, right? So I think you want to let this person feel heard in a time-boxed way, and then potentially take them aside. But in this situation, I'd encourage you to think about hiring a professional facilitator who can handle these dynamics live in the room.
I think that's a great point. And I think in regards to the logistics and agenda piece of if that's part of the culture, and even let's say it's not arguing, but maybe like you're part of a very candid culture where like encouraging people to constantly speak up and give their opinions, then like factor in that session's going to probably take a little bit longer because people are going to be interjecting and there's going to be a lot of back and forth. I think it just kind of depends, but I love the idea of having a facilitator and maybe somebody who's not part of the organization specifically because they're just like an unbiased third party person who's like keeping time and keeping things moving along. I don't know, do you think it makes a difference if it's somebody external versus internal, Lindsey, from like a organizational leadership perspective?
Um, Tricky question. I think it oftentimes takes the burden off of people to be that facilitator, and lets people just have the role of being a part of the organization. So I think it can be really beneficial to have an external person who can maybe say the hard things without as much fear or concern. Someone did say in the chat to have ground rules. Yes, I think yes, have ground rules. Doesn't mean people will follow them though. So what happens when we don't do that?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing on that, Lindsey, is if say you don't have the budget for a facilitator and somehow that lands on you as the EA who's helping put this on, I'm putting myself into those shoes, imagining this happening. And I think, Lindsey, based off what you said, is the important thing is that people want to feel seen and heard. So maybe it's not appropriate for them to hash it out right then and there, but maybe just create the place for them to funnel that. Like we were talking about the post-it thing is what they wanted to accomplish and what was done. Maybe there's an area where that's like an ice box or something to talk about later, and that could be a good opportunity to be like, hey, that's a great topic. I know it's really important. Like let's put that here so we can table it for a discussion at another time or after the offsite.
Yeah, I love that.
We had somebody who wanted to double click on, I think it was really like tip 2, but with Beth sharing that she would organize the agenda by subject, and they didn't quite understand what you meant by subject. Because they thought maybe the speaker activity already was its own subject. So can you break that down a little bit more about what you mean by
Sure.
organizing and creating that structure?
Yeah, so sorry if that was confusing. when we talk about a structure, we're talking about a way to organize what we're doing. So in our case, we had 3 objectives. The first one was understand how somebody's individual contributions affects the whole. So our first part of the structure was understanding I. We did that by doing like some personality tests and understanding like the way that we work as individuals. So it was all focused on the individual. Secondly, was the legal team is broken up into different sub teams. And so the second thing we wanted to do was focus on everything sub team related. So that's time to sit with your team, go through some activities together. And then lastly was our team as a whole. So understanding how us as individuals and then the sub teams as the bigger pieces fit into the whole of legal at the company. So each session we did throughout the offsite focused on these 3 things in that order, so it made sense to them. So that's what I mean about the subjects of or the structure of how the offsite was created for that particular year. I
And I'll
hope
just
that makes more sense.
let us know if it doesn't. And I also jump in and say the reason we did that, started with I, is because that's what people care about. They care about themselves first, right? That's a way that we help people feel seen and heard, is we're not going to start with the all. People need to know how it affects them personally first, right? So that's why we sort of went I, we, all versus other way around. So anyway, hope that helps.
Yeah. And we got a note saying that was super helpful. So great.
Oh, wow.
All right, we will have project teams getting together to have in-person focused work time to get their projects over the line. Any suggestions, since I won't be there and a product manager won't be there to facilitate?
Well, I have some questions about this question. If I'm reading between the lines, it means that they're not getting the projects over the line, which is why they're in person. Uh, that's kind of what I'm reading into this. I mean, I'd want to know why it's not getting over the line. I'd want to know kind of how this has been communicated. Um, I have a couple of ideas. Some of them may not be great. We'll just throw them out. Could you find a way to make this something competitive? No. Okay. Thank you for the clarity. Let me look at the chat. I see. Bring people together. A couple things I might consider is, maybe making it competitive of sorts, thinking about not just the structure of like doing the work, but the learning of it. So maybe having a learning goal for the offsite and not just a performance goal, and thinking about how that can sort of help support multiple things that the business wants. And then I am a really big fan of having people teach back what they did or teach back what they learned as a way to, sort of move everyone together and uplift them at once. And so maybe there's a way to sort of show and tell is kind of a bad word for this, but sort of show your work, get feedback on it, and support each other. So it's not just like each individual group working on their project. So I think the answer to your question is just structure. Structure is your best friend. Structure is my best friend, and find a way for there to be kind of a satisfying end to that offsite. So people feel like they're working towards something and not just finishing a project. Hope that helped.
Yeah, Lindsay, I think one thing that we didn't really talk about, which was a huge component of both of the offsites that you helped us with over the last couple of years, was the in-person time and connecting with other people. Like sometimes I feel like we get so stuck on the content and what we want to accomplish that we kind of forget about the human aspect of being together in person and giving people time to do that. So I feel like we built a lot of that into our offsites. It wasn't just like, session after session of content, finishing projects, focusing on goals, things like that. But giving them the time to build those relationships, because essentially if they build those relationships, they'll work better together. And it's more likely that they're able to finish those projects and get them over the line when they're all in lockstep together and able to build those relationships.
Yeah, what we're trying to find here is a way to tip the scales so the offsite isn't just casual and about connecting, but actually achieve specific objectives and goals. And I know there's one more question that just came in. I'll say this though. One thing to pay attention to, I think it's not enough to put people in a room and assume they will connect. Connection doesn't just happen. We actually have to create it, and structure is a big way that we do that. I think about how a couple years ago I was out to dinner with some friends, and I saw this like team dinner happen. They all walked into this big table next to us, and I saw everyone talking except one person, and they looked kind of sad and alone and a little dejected. And I thought to myself, I wonder how they are helping support connection as opposed to just assuming it will happen when they sit down to dinner together. And so you don't need a facilitator necessarily, but you do need to be thoughtful around how you're creating the conditions for that connection to happen, versus assuming it will do it. So anyways,
Any suggestions that kind of goes to this next question of like ways that you could engage, and even if it is casual time, is it, having table topics or, tell me a little bit more about that, because this question that came through Alice was examples of activities of engagement for the third part of the whole, but this could also be, relevant to that same thing of if it's casual time, how do you continue to do engagement?
I just
yeah,
think oh, sorry, go ahead, Lindsay.
no, you go.
The only thing I was just going to directly answer the question in asking about the Fivetran case study of like what examples of activities did we use for this. So what we did for the first year to bring it back to the whole was we did have a session on our H2 second half of the year goals and strategy. So we had these had been talked about during the offsite, but essentially what we did was we showed the goals and the strategy for the year on the screen, and then we gave everybody 2 minutes to answer these questions. We asked them specific questions. What stands out to you about these company goals? What excites you or gives you pause about them? What do these goals mean to you, like to your sub team, and how does it affect us? And lastly, what are we going to do about this? When we look at these, what's our next step? So that was our way to kind of bring people in, get their thoughts on the entire whole of what we were looking at after the offsite.
Thanks for sharing. And to the question around ways to add some structure or some connection into more casual offsites. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to do this. My pet peeve is when all this feels forced and like forced fun. And I think people are adults, let's treat them like adults. And so some things I've done is, to Megan's point, yeah, have kind of some questions, like tabletop questions, just that are there, that people can choose to engage in or not, that might be related to the company goals or topics, or ways for people to connect, that offers them, especially introverts, a safe way to open the conversation that doesn't necessarily feel like small talk. Like what are we supposed to talk about? The weather? Like I don't know. So this might be something. Something else I've seen done is, there's a company called Culture Amp, which is known for a lot of people science and employee engagement surveys and the like. And they have something called belonging badges, which are little pins that you can pick up that help to sort of describe you in a way that, again, eases that opening conversation. So for example, like parent, introvert, dog lover, whatever those things are, then you can easily find bonds and ways to start the conversation in a way that, again, feels more safe. So those are a couple of things that you can try.
I think we probably have time for one more question. This was from earlier in the session through the chat from Angela. She asked, what question or suggestions do you have for meetings that need to work through decision making? I feel that decision making needs a good framework and ground rules, and things can get way off track. How would you introduce the need for a process or even an outside facilitator when attendees are too attached to their positions?
Oof. Just a light question to end the
I
webinar.
know.
This is, where is it? It's in the chat.
Yeah, I was in the chat back at like 10:30, 10:29.
Okay, I'm a visual person and just want to read this real quick. Decision making needs a good framework for a process. How do you introduce any for a process? Angela, I'm happy to chat offline. I think there's a bunch of decision making frameworks, like different hats people can wear. What is it called? 7 hats or something. I'd like to know more about why people are so adverse to having a process. I'd like to know more about the group dynamics involved in all of this. People are at the heart of what we do, and people are all unique snowflakes, which makes this fun and also sometimes challenging to put these offsites together. So I'm happy to chat more with you if that's useful. I think ground rules can be especially helpful to a decision-making process, but there has to be buy-in that people want to do it this way. So it sounds like there might be more getting in the way, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you as well.
Amazing.
Not an easy answer. It's not an easy
Loaded question.
Yeah, I wish I could give you a simple one, but I'd like to know more.
Okay, great. And then one other thing, just quickly. Let's see. What was the name of the culture site? You said it was Culture Amp, right?
Oh, Culture Amp, yes.
And then with the belonging badges, yeah, and we can drop that in a follow-up too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, anything else that we didn't talk about that people have questions on, or anything else, Beth and Lindsay, that you would like to add before we go?
Maybe Beth, if you could just go to the next slide, I'll just sort of like give a quick hello or plug. I hope you can tell that I love this topic and think it's so important and useful. And just highlighting some of the folks I've worked with, companies as small as 20 and as big as 100,000. So if you're worried you're too small or too big, please don't be concerned. Multiple ways that we can connect or work together. And I'd love to help you and help you shine. Like I hope I helped Beth shine, because that's really my goal at the end of the day. And I just want to thank Beth for doing this with me and sharing the story of Fivetran, and thanks Megan for allowing us to.
And I will say, Lindsay, thank you. I feel like you have me, everything I took away from our time working on both of the years of this offsite together, I take in all the time now. So even I question everything, every gathering that we have. Like they recently ran an idea by about doing a combined meeting at our company for a couple of the different organizations. And my first thing was the pause. It was the like, but hold on, what's the purpose here? Like, do the people want this, or is this something that we're just signing them up for and making them attend? So thank you, Lindsay, for helping kind of drill that home and doing things with people instead of at them. I think it's helped train me well. So.
My goal is to increase your confidence in your ability to do this without me. So I'm glad that was possible. And again, thank you. Thanks for all of this. And thank you, Megan, for having us. Thanks
Thank
to
you,
everyone
Megan.
for being here. I hope you found this valuable and useful, and we appreciate your interest and time for sure.
Yeah, I mean, thank you both. I think this is so important and so relevant. I'm so grateful for all the, first of all, work. I just want to say that both Lindsay and Beth put into this presentation, and probably the most anybody has ever put into a presentation for one of our webinars. And I think, that's, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but it was just so fun working on this with you over the past month. And I'm really grateful for you taking the time to share this with my community.
Our pleasure. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining.
Rest of
Bye.
your day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.